the day Levi Graves signed his name across the bottom of the foreclosure papers for the Slater land. He told himself it was just business, that the numbers did not lie, that a man in his position could not afford to let sentiment cloud his judgment. And then he rode home through the amber dust of the Arizona Territory evening and found a woman sitting on his porch steps with a shotgun across her knees and fire in her dark eyes that made him wonder, for the first time in a long while, whether the numbers had been wrong after all. The year was 1883, and the town of Red Rock Crossing sat like a stubborn old nail in the southern stretch of Arizona Territory, hammered into the high desert between two mountain ranges that turned purple at dusk. It was not a beautiful town exactly, but it had the particular kind of permanence that came from people who had refused to be driven away by heat and drought, and the various catastrophes that the frontier saw fit to deliver season after season. There was a main street with a general store, a bank, a saloon that doubled as a dining house on Sunday afternoons, a telegraph office, and a handful of other establishments that kept the community breathing. Around the town, ranches and homesteads spread out across the red earth like fingers reaching for water, and most of those ranches were connected by a web of old debts and older grievances that everyone knew about and nobody discussed in polite company. Levi Graves was 32 years old that summer, broad through the shoulders, with hands that showed the calluses of a man who had worked cattle and fence line before he'd ended up behind the desk at Red Rock Crossing's only lending institution, the Territorial Bank and Land Office. His father had founded the bank 15 years ago, and when the elder Graves had died of fever 3 winters back, Levi had stepped into the role of bank manager with a kind of quiet, measured competence that the townspeople respected even if they didn't particularly warm to him. He had dark hair that wanted to curl at the collar if he let it grow too long, a jaw that stayed set even when he was uncertain, and green eyes that his mother had always said were too soft for a man who wore such a stern expression. He lived alone in a house at the edge of town that was larger than he needed and quieter than he liked. Lucy Slater was 26, and she had been fighting for the Slater homestead since she was 19 years old, which was the year her father drank himself past saving, and her mother had gone to live with a sister in New Mexico Territory and not come back. Lucy had 2 younger brothers, Thomas, who was 20, and Danny, who was 17, and she had kept the 3 of them together on 40 acres of decent grazing land and a farmhouse that listed slightly to the east. She was not tall, but she carried herself like she was, with dark brown hair that she wore pinned up during the day and a set of opinions she never hesitated to share. Her eyes were the color of good whiskey, warm and amber, and capable of expressing a full range of feeling in a single glance, from genuine warmth to a fury so direct it could stop a man mid-sentence. The Slater land had been mortgaged to the Territorial Bank 2 years ago when Lucy needed money to replace a collapsed barn and buy seed cattle after a bad winter wiped out half her herd. The loan had seemed manageable at the time, and it might have stayed that way if the summer of 1883 had not turned into the worst drought the territory had seen in a generation. The grass went brown and brittle. The creek that crossed the eastern pasture dropped to a trickle and then to nothing by July. Lucy sold 2 of her best horses to make a payment in the spring, and she'd had Thomas working at the livery in town since May, and she'd taken in mending from half the women in Red Rock Crossing, and still the numbers would not come together. She had gone to the bank in August to ask for an extension, and the man at the counter had told her that decisions like that were not his to make, and that she would need to speak with Mr. Graves. She had not got to speak with Mr. Graves. He had been away in Tucson for 2 weeks on bank business, and when he returned, the papers had already been drawn up by his second clerk based on the standing instructions Levi had left regarding accounts that were more than 60 days in default. Levi had come back to his desk, reviewed the stack of papers his clerk presented, signed each one in turn with the focused efficiency of a man who had learned that hesitation cost more than decisiveness. And he had not noticed until later that evening, when he was reviewing the full account ledger, that the Slater account had a notation from the counter clerk that the account holder had come in specifically requesting a meeting with him. By then, his signature was on the papers. By then, the notice had already been sent out. He had told himself he would look into it in the morning, that there might be remedies, that perhaps an arrangement could still be reached. He had told himself this with the particular self-deception of a man who does not wish to examine his own complicity too closely, and then he had ridden home in the long Arizona evening light, tying his horse at the post by his gate, and he had looked up at his porch and stopped. She was sitting on his second porch step, her dark hair pulled back but coming loose in several places, her dress dusty at the hem, and a double-barreled shotgun lying across her knees as casual as a sewing basket. She was not pointing it at him. She was simply making clear that she had it. Her whiskey-brown eyes found him with the precision of someone who had been rehearsing exactly what she planned to say and was now deciding whether any of it was worth the breath. "Miss Slater," he said carefully. "Mr. Graves," she replied. He stood at the gate. She sat on his step. A hot wind moved through the yard, stirring the single cottonwood tree that grew beside the house and scattering a handful of dry leaves across the dirt. "You want to come down from my porch," he said, "or would you rather we conduct this conversation with me standing in my own yard?" "I'll come down when I'm ready," she said. "Which will be after you tell me how a man can sign papers taking a woman's land without so much as reading her a single line of that contract she signed 2 years ago that said, very clearly, that she was entitled to meet with a bank representative to discuss the terms of any default action before any legal proceedings were initiated." Levi was quiet for a moment. He had not read that clause. He was thinking very carefully about whether he had read that clause. "You have a copy of your loan agreement with you," he said. She reached into the cloth bag that was sitting on the step beside her and produced a folded document that had been handled enough times to be soft at the creases. She held it up. He walked through the gate and up the path. She did not move from the step. He reached out and she placed the document in his hand, and he stood there in the fading light and read. He got to the relevant clause on the second page and read it twice, and then he folded the document back along its creases and returned it to her. "You are correct," he said. "I know I am correct," she said. "The question is what you are going to do about it." "The question," he said, "is considerably more complicated than that, and I would like to have that conversation properly, which means inside and with some light if you are willing." She looked at him for a long moment. Whatever she was measuring in him, she seemed to find enough of it. "I will come inside," she said, standing and lifting the shotgun, "but this comes with me." "I would not expect anything else," he said. He had been telling himself it was just business. Standing in his own kitchen with Lucy Slater setting her shotgun against the wall beside the door, and pulling out a chair at his table with the calm authority of a woman who had decided to take up as much space as the situation required, he was beginning to suspect that the business had just become considerably more personal. He lit the lamp and put the coffee on because it was something to do with his hands, and she sat at his table and folded her hands in front of her, and waited with a patience that suggested she had learned to be very still when she was very angry. He set a cup in front of her when it was ready and sat down across from her and said, "Tell me the full picture." "Everything from the beginning," she told him. She told him about the winter of 1881 that killed the cattle, about the barn that had come down under a snowfall in February, about the loan and the terms she had agreed to, and the payments she had made faithfully for 14 months. She told him about the drought, about the creek drying up, about selling the horses. She told him about her brothers, about Thomas working at the livery, about Danny who was too young to be carrying the weight he was carrying. She told him without asking for pity, just presenting the facts in the clear, direct way of a woman who had long since learned that excessive emotion in a business negotiation was used against you. But he could hear, underneath the precision of it, what it had cost her, what those 40 acres meant, how long she had held on to them. Levi listened without interrupting. He was good at listening, which was one of the things people occasionally noticed about him despite his reputation for being difficult. When she finished, he sat with it for a moment. "The clause you cited is valid," he said. "The proceeding was initiated without that meeting being offered, which means the foreclosure notice is procedurally deficient. I made an error." She was watching him. "Are you telling me you can stop it?" "I am telling you the notice is deficient," he said, "which means it needs to be reissued, which means there is a window before any legal action can proceed. Within that window, I can place your account under a review arrangement, which essentially means the foreclosure is paused while a formal assessment is conducted." He paused. That assessment would need to determine whether an extension or restructured repayment schedule would be viable. "And would it be?" she asked. Her voice was very even. "I don't know yet," he said honestly. "I would need to look at the full account, see the actual figures, understand the realistic timeline for when you can begin generating income again. The drought will not last forever. If we get good rains in October, which the territory has seen before, the land would recover. The question is whether the numbers can hold together long enough." She was quiet for a moment. "So you're not just going to hand me my land back?" "No," he said. "I'm not going to hand you anything. But I am telling you that you have a legitimate grievance based on a procedural failure on my part, and that I intend to handle it correctly. Which means a review, which means I need information and you need to give it to me honestly, even the parts that are bad." Something shifted in her expression. It was not warmth exactly, not yet, but it was something adjacent to relief, which was perhaps more important. "All right," she said. "Not tonight," he said. "Tonight it is too late and we are both tired. Come to the bank the day after tomorrow. Tomorrow I need to review your file and we will go through everything properly." She nodded, standing and picking up her shotgun. He walked her to the door. She paused in the doorway and turned back to him, and the lamplight caught the amber of her eyes and the loose strands of dark hair at her temple, and he noticed these things with the attentiveness of a man who had not noticed a woman in quite some time. "Mr. Graves," she said, "why are you doing this? You could have just told me the notice stands and sent me on my way." "Because I made an error," he said, "and I don't leave my errors lying on the floor." She considered this. "All right," she said again, and walked out into the dark, and he watched her go until she disappeared down the road, and then he stood in his doorway for a long time looking at nothing. The next morning, Levi was at the bank before his clerks arrived. He pulled the Slater account file and spent 3 hours going through every entry, every payment record, every notation. What he found was a woman who had, by any reasonable measure, done everything a person could do to meet her obligations. The payments had been consistent and on time for 14 months. The default was 2 payments, both falling within the drought period. The land itself, based on the survey records, was solid acreage with good soil, and a creek that, he checked the county records, had historically recovered after drought periods. The mortgage amount was not extreme relative to the land's value. His second clerk, a man named Harmon who had been with the bank since its founding and had the disposition of someone who had made peace with disappointing people, stopped by Levi's office door that morning. "Saw you pulled the Slater file," Harmon said. "I did," Levi said. "The notice went out properly," Harmon said, "per your standing instructions." "The notice," Levi said without looking up, "failed to provide the account holder with the meeting she was entitled to under the terms of her loan agreement, which means it was not, in fact, proper." Harmon was quiet for a moment. "You going to reissue it?" "I'm going to review the account and determine the appropriate course of action," Levi said. "The board is going to want to know." "I am aware of that," Levi said. "Tell them I am conducting a review and that I will have a recommendation within 2 weeks." He finally looked up. "And Harmon, in the future, when an account holder comes in requesting a meeting with me about a default proceeding, I want a note placed in the file and the proceeding held until I return." Those were not the instructions I intended to leave. Harmon had the grace not to say anything further. When Lucy came to the bank 2 days later, she came without the shotgun, wearing a clean dress that was nonetheless worn at the collar and hem in the way that spoke of careful use of limited resources. She sat across from Levi's desk with her account records spread between them, and they spent the better part of 2 hours going through the numbers together. She was not apologetic about the situation. She was not self-pitying. She answered his questions directly and offered information he hadn't asked for when she thought it was relevant, which he found himself appreciating. "If we get fall rain," she said, "I can have 30 head of breeding stock by spring. Thomas has been offered a full-time position at the livery, so his income is reliable. I can take in laundry as well as mending through the winter. I can make 2 payments by December if the bank will carry the account until October. The board will want security beyond the land," he said. "I don't have anything else of significant value." "I know," he said. He picked up his pen and wrote several figures on the paper in front of him. "Here is what I am going to propose to the board. A 6-month forbearance period, meaning no payments due until March, after which the account will be current under a revised schedule that extends the loan term by 8 months to account for the missed payments. The interest accrued during forbearance is added to the principal. At the end of the forbearance, you begin payments on the revised schedule." She was watching him. "Will the board agree to that?" "I will make the case," he said. "It is not in the bank's interest to foreclose on a viable property during a regional drought. The land would sit empty or sell at a fraction of its value. The board understands arithmetic. And if they don't agree," he met her eyes, "then we will have another conversation." She left with the understanding that he would have an answer within a week. He watched her go through the bank's front window, walking down the main street of Redrock Crossing with her shoulders straight and her head up, and he felt something he had not felt in years, which was the particular desire to make a specific outcome happen, not for reasons of sound business practice, but because he could not tolerate the alternative. The board meeting was on Friday. Levi presented the Slater account with the full analysis he had prepared, including comparable accounts in neighboring territories that had been restructured during the drought of 1877 and had ultimately performed well for the banks that held them. He made the case systematically and without sentiment, because sentiment would not move this particular board. It was close. The 2 older board members had the frontier banker's instinctive preference for clean resolutions, and a foreclosure was cleaner on paper than a restructure. But the numbers Levi presented were sound, and in the end, the board approved the forbearance. He sent a message to the Slater homestead the following morning. Lucy came in that afternoon. "The board approved," he said, and watched the lines of her face do something complicated, as though she had been holding a great weight at a particular angle for a very long time and had only now been allowed to set it down. "Thank you," she said. It was quiet and direct, without the cautious edge she had worn in their previous meetings. "Come back in October," he said. "We will review again then and confirm the payment schedule." She stood to leave, then stopped. "Mr. Graves, I know this was more trouble than a straightforward account would have been. I appreciate that you looked at the situation and did not simply let it stand." He thought about telling her it was just correcting his own error, which was what he had been telling himself. Instead he said, "Your land is worth keeping. Anyone who looked at those 40 acres honestly would see that." She looked at him, and he was not certain what she saw, but something in her expression softened past the careful boundary she had maintained in all their dealings, just for a moment. "It is," she said. "My father planted the cottonwoods along the south fence line the same spring Thomas was born. Danny doesn't even remember a time before them." She paused. "They are tall enough to give shade now." He thought about that for the rest of the afternoon. Redrock Crossing was small enough that 2 people who had business dealings could not easily avoid each other, and small enough that, when one person began to appear slightly more often in the peripheral vision of another, the shift was noticeable. Levi found reasons to ride past the eastern edge of town, where the road to the Slater homestead branched off, not down the road itself, just past the branching point. which he told himself was because he checked the condition of the county road as part of his responsibilities as a member of the town council. He noticed that she came to the general store on Tuesday mornings, and that she took her supper at the boarding house dining room on Friday evenings when she came to town to collect the mending she took in. He did not manufacture encounters. He had enough self-awareness to recognize that the impulse existed, and enough stubbornness to refuse to act on it without a proper occasion. What he did do was accept an invitation from Tom Hale at the livery to come look at a horse Tom thought he might want to purchase, knowing full well that Thomas Slater worked at the livery, and that Thomas was Lucy's brother, and that he might therefore hear something about how the homestead was faring. He heard more than something. Thomas Slater was 20 years old and had his sister's directness without quite her management of it, and within 10 minutes of showing Levi the horse in question, he had shared that the creek had shown signs of water again 2 weeks ago, that there was a small herd grazing on the eastern pasture, and that his sister was wearing herself into the ground because she would not ask for help from anyone. "She does not have to do it alone," Levi heard himself say. Thomas gave him a look that contained several things at once, including something sharp and assessing that reminded him very strongly of Lucy. "No, she does not," Thomas said. "But she is the sort of person who has to learn that herself." "How is she managing?" Levi asked, which was more direct than he had intended. "Better than she was," Thomas said. "Worse than she will be." He paused. "She talks about the bank business sometimes, says you were fair." "I was correct," Levi said. "There's a difference." Thomas smiled at that. "She said something like that about you too." Levi bought the horse, which was a good animal and a fair price, and rode it home thinking about a woman who talked about him in the evenings, even if what she said was that he had been correct rather than kind. The October meeting came on a Thursday. Lucy arrived at the bank in the early afternoon when the day's heat was breaking and the light was turning that particular slanted gold that the Arizona autumn did so well. She was wearing her good dress, the dark blue one he had seen her in twice before, and her hair was pinned with more care than usual, which he noticed and then spent some time not noticing. She sat across his desk and they reviewed the account. The creek was running. The early rains had come. She had 31 head of breeding cattle and had already made arrangements to sell 8 to a ranch in the next county in the spring. Thomas's income from the livery was steady. She had a realistic path to the March payment. "You are in good position," he said. "Better than I expected," she admitted. "The land came back faster than I thought it would." "Good soil holds water longer than it seems," he said. "The drought years are hard, but the recovery is real." She looked out the window at the main street. "My father always said that land remembers what it is supposed to do, that you just have to get through the bad years." "He was right about that," Levi said. She looked back at him. "I don't know that he was right about much else, but he was right about the land." He heard the thing underneath that, the grief and the complication of loving someone who had let you down. "My father," he said, which was not something he said often, "started this bank to help people. That was the original intention. It is easy to lose sight of that in the day-to-day." He paused. "I think I had lost sight of it. Your situation reminded me." She was quiet for a moment. "That is a generous thing to say about a woman who showed up on your porch with a shotgun." He almost smiled. The shotgun was effective communication. She did smile at that, and it was the first time he had seen her smile in the full, uncalculated way that reached her eyes, and it rearranged something in him that he was not certain could be put back in its original configuration. "I owe you an apology for that," she said, still smiling slightly. "It was not the most rational approach." "You had run out of rational approaches," he said. "You had tried the door. The porch was the next logical step." She laughed then, a short, genuine sound that was better than anything he had heard in a long time, and he sat back in his chair and felt something ease in his chest that had been tight for longer than he could remember. "Mr. Graves," she said, sobering slightly but keeping that warmth in her expression, "I would like to buy you supper. Not as a thank you for the forbearance, that was just business, and I will repay every cent of it. But as an apology for the porch and as an acknowledgement that you dealt honestly with me when you did not have to." He looked at her for a moment. "The boarding house on Friday," he said. "I believe that is your usual evening." She tilted her head. "You know my schedule." He was quiet for a beat too long, which told her everything. "The boarding house on Friday," she said. 7 o'clock. They had supper at the boarding house on Friday, and it lasted until the proprietress, a sharp-eyed woman named Mrs. Delacroix, began very pointedly putting chairs up on the other tables. They talked about everything and nothing in the way that people do when they are conducting a careful exploration of someone they are drawn to, touching the edges of things to see where the shape of the other person lies. He told her about growing up in the bank's shadow, his father's expectations, and his own ambivalent relationship with them. She told him about the years of holding the homestead together, the particular education in self-reliance that her father's failures had given her. They disagreed, pointedly but without heat, about the recent influx of large cattle companies buying up territory land, with her saying that it was grinding small homesteaders out of the picture, and him saying that the economics were more complicated than that, and then arguing back and forth until they had each shifted slightly and arrived at something closer to a shared view than either of them had started with. Walking back down the main street in the late evening, the air gone cool and the stars enormous overhead, she said, "You argue well. You don't just wait for a space to say your piece. You actually listen." "You argue better," he said. "You change your position when the argument warrants it, which most people won't do. My mother would say that I am too stubborn to change my position and too honest to stay there once I know I am wrong," she said, "which is an awkward combination." "It seems to be working," he said. She stopped at the point where the main street turned toward the road east, where the Slater homestead lay. She had ridden in on a dun mare that was hitched at the general store post. "Friday evenings," she said, looking up at him with the amber of her eyes catching the lamplight from the store window. "I would not be opposed to making them a regular arrangement, if you are not opposed." "I am not opposed," he said. "Good," she said. "Then I will see you next Friday." She paused. "Good night, Levi." It was the first time she had used his given name. He was aware of it the way you are aware of something you have been waiting for without quite knowing that you were waiting. "Good night, Lucy," he said. He stood on the main street and watched her ride east until she was swallowed by the dark, and the night was very clear and very quiet around him, and for the first time in years, he was not in any hurry to go home to his empty house. Fridays became a fixed point of the week, and then so did occasional Tuesday mornings, when he found that he had reason to visit the general store, and then a Wednesday afternoon in late October when she came by the bank not for business, but to drop off a parcel of honey that she had somehow acquired from a Papago woman at the market, and thought he might like because she had mentioned once, in passing, that he put honey in his coffee, and she had remembered. He stood holding the jar of honey and watched her walk back out to the street and realized, with the clarity that sometimes comes before you are ready for it, that he was entirely in love with her. He did not say this. They were not at the point where it could be said, or rather he was not certain they were, and he was a man who had learned to be careful with the things that mattered most precisely because the things that mattered most were the ones you could lose. But it changed the quality of his attention. He noticed everything. The way she listened to people fully, with her head slightly tilted. The way she made decisions quickly and without second-guessing. The way she was with her brothers, fierce and warm in equal measure. The way she laughed, still infrequent enough that each instance felt like a small gift. In November, there was a town social at the hall on the main street, the kind of event that Redrock Crossing organized twice a year with fiddle music and dancing, and an unspoken understanding that it served as the community's primary engine of courtship. Levi went because he was on the town council, and his absence would be remarked upon. Lucy came because Thomas dragged her there, which was what she told Levi when he found her standing at the edge of the room holding a cup of punch, and watching the dancing with the alert, slightly amused expression of someone who is finding the event more entertaining than they expected. "Thomas has been here 20 minutes and has already danced 3 times," she said when Levi stopped beside her. "He has good timing," Levi said. "He has inherited my mother's gift for being entirely comfortable anywhere he goes," she said. "I did not receive that particular inheritance." "You seem comfortable enough," he said. "That is a skill I learned," she said. "It is different from the actual thing." She glanced at him sideways. "Do you dance, Mr. Graves?" "Levi," he said. "Levi," she conceded, "do you dance?" "Not well," he said, "but adequately." "Adequate dancing is all that is required at a town social," she said, and held out her hand. He took it and they danced, and he was not merely adequate. He was better than that, with the natural physical competence of a man who was well coordinated, and who, when presented with something worth doing properly, did it properly. She danced well too, with the kind of easy rhythm that came from genuine feeling for music, and they moved through 2 dances without stepping wrong, and by the end of the second dance they were dancing closer than the occasion strictly required, and she did not move back to the proper distance. The fiddle went to a slower tune and the floor cleared somewhat. They stayed. She was close enough that he could smell the cedar and something sweeter that was in her hair, and her hand was in his, and the lamplight in the hall was warm and golden, and he thought that if he did not say something he would spend the rest of his life regretting it. "Lucy," he said, quietly enough that only she could hear. "I know," she said, without him saying anything further, which was either the most frightening or the most perfect thing that had ever happened to him. She met his eyes, and in hers was everything he needed to see, the same recognition, the same careful awareness of how much was on the line, and beneath it the same wanting. "I would like to come calling properly," he said, "if you would have me." "I will have you," she said, "on the condition that you come on horseback and not with paperwork." He almost laughed. "I can manage that." She smiled up at him and the fiddle played on. He began calling on her in the proper sense on the following Sunday, riding out to the homestead on the dun horse he had purchased from the livery, Thomas's livery, which he suspected was not a coincidence in Thomas's view, and tying up at the post while Lucy came out to meet him. Danny, her younger brother, regarded him from the barn doorway with the elaborate casualness of someone performing indifference and doing it badly. Thomas appeared from around the side of the house with his sleeves rolled up and shook Levi's hand with an entirely unsurprised expression. They walked the property in the Sunday afternoon light, Lucy pointing out the features of the land with a proprietorial love that was evident in every word. The cottonwoods along the south fence line that her father had planted, tall enough now to give real shade, their leaves turned yellow in the November air. The creek that was running again, a thin, bright line through the eastern pasture. The new barn, solid and squared, that she and Thomas had built the previous spring. The small kitchen garden that she kept going through the mild Arizona winters. "It is good land," he said, and meant it entirely. "It is the best land in this part of the territory," she said, with a conviction that was not pride so much as simple knowledge. "It floods right. It drains right. In a good year this soil will grow anything." He looked at her, standing in her own field with the late light on her face and the yellow cottonwood leaves shifting in the wind behind her, and said, "I am sorry about the foreclosure notice. I know we have addressed it procedurally. But I am sorry that it happened, that you had to come to my porch the way you did." She looked at him steadily. "You fixed it," she said. "I should have been paying better attention," he said. "You came in requesting a meeting and it should have been noted and acted on, and it was not. Your land nearly disappeared because I was careless. You were running a bank alone after your father died," she said. "That is not nothing." "No," he said, "but it is not an excuse." She was quiet for a moment. The creek murmured in the distance. "Levi, I am not holding it against you. I want you to know that. What I did hold against you, you resolved. The rest of it, the difficulty of the situation, the drought, the fear of losing this place, none of that is on you." She looked at the cottonwoods. And for what it is worth, coming to your porch with that shotgun was the most honest conversation I had with anyone that whole year. Nobody else was willing to hear me." He reached out and took her hand, which he had not done outside of a dance floor before. She looked down at their joined hands and then up at him. "I hear you," he said. "I want you to know that." She turned her hand over and held his back, and they stood like that in the middle of her field as the light went golden and long, and neither of them spoke for a while because there was nothing that needed to be said. Danny called from the barn that if they were going to stand around all afternoon doing nothing, someone might consider helping with the evening feed, and Lucy called back that he was perfectly capable of doing the evening feed himself. And from somewhere behind the barn Thomas could be heard laughing, and Levi stood in the middle of the Slater homestead and felt, for perhaps the first time in his adult life, exactly where he was supposed to be. December arrived with a cold snap that the territory was not always graced with, frost on the ground in the mornings and clear cold days that made the sky an impossible shade of blue. The Slater homestead was managing well. Lucy had made her first payment under the revised schedule in November, on time and without difficulty. Levi reviewed the account himself, wrote the receipt himself, and filed it with a particular satisfaction. He came to supper at the homestead for the first time in early December. Danny, who was 17 and deeply suspicious of any man who might have authority over his family in any form, sat across the table and studied Levi for the duration of the meal, with the focused concentration of someone performing a comprehensive assessment. He asked Levi, with the directness that the Slater family appeared to distribute equally across all its members, what exactly his intentions were toward his sister. Lucy said, "Daniel." "He's calling on you every Sunday," Danny said. "Seems like a reasonable question." "My intentions," Levi said, keeping his tone level and meeting Danny's eyes directly, "are to know your sister better, to be worthy of her good opinion, and to behave honorably in all of it." He paused. "And she will make any decisions about what comes next in her own time and on her own terms, which I respect." Danny regarded him for another moment. "All right," he said, and went back to his supper with the air of someone who has delivered a verdict. Thomas, across the table, caught Levi's eye and gave him a small, satisfied nod. After supper, Lucy and Levi sat on the porch in the cold, clear night, wrapped in separate blankets, watching the stars wheel overhead. The cottonwoods along the south fence were bare now, their branches dark against the sky, still and beautiful. "Danny will come around," she said. "He does not need to come around," Levi said. "He was right to ask. A man who does not ask that question is not paying attention." She was quiet, then said, "You meant what you said, about my time and my terms." "I meant it," he said. Pulled the blanket tighter. "I have been self-sufficient for a long time, Levi. I have not made much room for other people, for relying on anyone. It became a habit that I am not certain I know how to break." "I am not asking you to break it," he said. "I am asking you to let me be someone you can rely on without it costing you something. They can coexist." She turned to look at him. The cold had brought color to her cheeks, and her eyes were very bright in the starlight. "You are a better man than I expected you to be," she said. "When I was sitting on your porch with that shotgun." "What did you expect?" he asked. "Someone who would call the sheriff," she said. "Or someone who would argue procedure at me until I went away, not someone who would listen." "The procedure was wrong," he said, "and you deserve to be heard." She reached across the space between them and put her hand on his, through the blanket and the cold, just the warmth of it. "I think," she said carefully, "that I am falling in love with you. I want you to know that because I think it is the honest thing to say, and I would rather say it plainly than circle around it for months." He turned his hand and held hers. "I am already there," he said. "I have been since October, I think, when you brought the honey." "The honey," she repeated and laughed softly. "It was the honey that did it," he said, perfectly seriously. She was still laughing, and he was watching her laugh in the cold starlight, and everything about it was exactly right. Winter passed in the steady rhythm of work and visits and long evenings, and the affection between them deepened the way things do when they are not forced, growing into something that was less like a feeling and more like a fact about the world. He came to supper every Sunday and stayed late enough that Danny eventually stopped going to bed early as a form of protest and started joining the conversation instead, revealing himself to be considerably warmer than his vigilance suggested and genuinely interested in the workings of the bank, which led to a running discussion about mathematics and economics that Levi eventually offered to continue in the form of occasional lessons, which Danny accepted with the elaborate indifference of someone who was deeply pleased. Thomas, for his part, had found a girl he was partial to, the daughter of the blacksmith, and was conducting his own courtship with considerably less subtlety than his sister had shown. January brought wind and cold, and a stretch of gray days that was unusual for the Arizona territory, and Lucy caught a chest cold that laid her out for a week. Levi heard about it from Thomas and came to the homestead despite it not being a Sunday, arriving at the door with a crock of soup from the boarding house kitchen and Mrs. Delacroix's good opinion apparently intact because she had packed it herself. Lucy came to the door wrapped in a blanket, her hair loose, her nose red, and looked at the crock of soup and then at him. "You did not have to do this," she said. "You would have done the same," he said. She thought about it. "I would," she admitted. "Come in." He stayed the afternoon, sitting in the chair by the fireplace while she lay on the settee under her blanket, and they talked, and he read to her from the newspaper he had brought, and she fell asleep partway through an account of congressional proceedings in Washington, and he sat and watched her sleep with the particular tenderness that comes from seeing someone who is always in motion finally be still. Danny came in from the barn and stopped at the sight of Levi in the chair. "She's sleeping?" Danny asked. "She is," Levi said quietly. Danny looked at his sister and then at Levi. "She does not let herself be unwell," he said. "She always just keeps working." "I know," Levi said. "She did that when our parents left too," Danny said. "Just kept working, never stopped long enough to be sad about it." He was quiet for a moment. "I am glad she has you now." Levi looked at the boy because he was still a boy, 17 and carrying things he should not have had to carry, and said, "I am glad too." Danny nodded and went to put the kettle on for tea, and the fire burned steadily in the fireplace, and Lucy slept, and Levi thought about the word now and what it implied about the future, and found that the future in that moment seemed not frightening but full. Lucy woke an hour later and found him still there and the room smelling of tea, and she sat up and looked at him for a long moment. "You stayed," she said. "I stayed," he agreed. She tucked her feet under her on the settee and wrapped both hands around the tea Danny had left on the side table. "I am not very good at being looked after," she said. "You are doing beautifully," he said. She made a face at him that dissolved into a reluctant smile. "You are impossible." "I have been told worse," he said. She looked at him with those amber eyes, softer than usual with sleep and the warmth of the fire. "Levi, if you were inclined toward something more permanent, I want you to know that I would not be opposed to a conversation about that." She looked down at her tea. "That is the least romantic way I have ever said anything." "No," he said, leaning forward in the chair. "It is the most honest way, which is considerably better." He set his own cup down. "I am more than inclined. I have been thinking about it since November." "November," she repeated, meeting his eyes. "The cottonwoods," he said, "standing in the field and holding your hand. That is when I knew that I wanted this to be permanent." She set her tea down and reached across the small space between them and put her hand along his jaw, which was the first time she had touched his face, and he turned into it slightly without meaning to. "Then let us have that conversation," she said. "You are sick," he said, "with a chest cold. The conversation will wait until you are well." "I am not that sick," she said. "The conversation will wait," he said firmly, "because when I ask you, I would like you to be in full possession of your faculties and not slightly feverish." She looked at him with those brilliant, warm eyes. "All right," she said, "but soon." "Soon," he agreed. He asked her in February, on a Sunday afternoon when the weather had turned briefly warm and the first tentative green was appearing in the pasture. He had thought about elaborate gestures and discarded them as not being right for either of them. What he did was walk with her along the south fence line where the cottonwoods stood in their winter patience, bare-branched against the blue sky, and stop beneath the tallest one and say, "Lucy, I would like to spend the rest of my life on this land with you, not managing your account, not calling on Sunday afternoons. Building something here with you and Thomas and Danny if you will have me." She was looking up at the branches and then she looked at him. "You want to live here," she said. "Not in town. The bank is a short ride," he said, "and Harmon is more than capable of managing the day-to-day. I have been thinking about reducing my hours there for a while now. There are other things I would rather put my time toward." He looked at the land around them, the creek glinting in the distance, the cattle in the eastern pasture. "I am good with numbers, and I am good with fence line, and I am good with cattle. I would rather use all three than just the first one." She was quiet, studying him the way she had studied him from the beginning, that careful, comprehensive assessment. "Yes," she said, "I will have you, obviously." He laughed, which surprised both of them, a full, unguarded laugh that she looked delighted by. "Obviously," he said. "It was obvious from October," she said. "The honey, apparently." He pulled her in and kissed her in the shade of the cottonwoods her father had planted, and she kissed him back with both hands on his face, and the Arizona sky was very blue and very big above them, and the land around them was coming alive again, recovering from the drought the way good land does, remembering what it was supposed to do. They were married in April, at the small church on the edge of Red Rock Crossing, in a ceremony that the entire town appeared at whether or not they had been formally invited, because the town had the collective view that the bank manager marrying the Slater woman was an event that concerned the community at large. Mrs. Delacroix provided the wedding supper. Thomas stood up for Levi, which had been Thomas's idea and Levi's genuine pleasure. Danny walked Lucy down the aisle with a solemn dignity that cost him considerable effort and made Lucy, who cried once and only once during the proceedings, cry at that specific moment. The ceremony was simple and the vows were said directly, in the way that suited both of them. When the preacher had finished and Levi had kissed his wife for the first time in front of the assembled population of Red Rock Crossing, Lucy leaned up and said very quietly against his jaw, "You know that I am going to be an extremely difficult person to be married to." "I know," he said. "I am counting on it." She laughed, and the whole church heard it, and the whole church smiled, because there was no sound in the world quite like Lucy Slater, Lucy Graves, laughing without reservation on her wedding day. They settled the question of the house practically and without drama. Levi's house in town was larger and could be let for income. Lucy's homestead was the land. The decision made itself. He moved his belongings to the Slater homestead in 3 wagon loads and fitted himself into the space as though he had always been in it, which was how it felt to both of them. He took the east-facing room that had been a storage room as his office, putting his desk by the window so that in the mornings he could look out at the pasture where the cattle grazed and the creek caught the early light. He still rode into Red Rock Crossing 4 days a week, but the hours were different now, more focused, and he had given Harmon the authority to manage routine matters without deferring everything to him, which both improved the bank's operations and freed Levi to be elsewhere. He repaired fence line on the property with the same methodical competence he brought to account reviews. He learned over that first spring the particular grammar of the Slater land, where it was inclined to be dry, where the water ran longest, which sections of fence the cattle tested, which patches of ground were best for the kitchen garden. Thomas departed the homestead that autumn to marry the blacksmith's daughter, Martha, in a wedding that was considerably louder and more festive than Levi and Lucy's, and settled into a house in town where he continued at the livery with an eye to eventually owning it. The leave-taking changed the homestead's rhythms, and the 3 people remaining in it, Levi, Lucy, and Danny, rearranged themselves around the new space. Danny turned 18 in November, and had begun riding for a cattle outfit to the north on occasional weeks, building the skills and the money that he said he intended to use to buy land of his own one day. He was still living at the homestead, but was a different presence in it than he had been, fuller, somehow more certain of himself. He and Levi had the kind of relationship that had been built slowly and honestly, with the mutual respect of two people who had both, in their different ways, invested in Lucy's well-being. One evening in November, Danny said at supper, "I want to tell you both something. I have been thinking about it a long time." He looked at Levi. "When you first started coming around here, I did not know what to make of you. You were the man from the bank, and I had heard Lucy talking about the foreclosure papers, and I thought," he paused, "I thought you might be the kind of man who was going to use the situation, who was going to show up with good manners and make things worse." "I know," Levi said. "You are not that man," Danny said. "I want you to know that I know that now, and I am glad my sister chose you." He looked down at his plate. "That is all." Lucy looked at her brother with an expression so full of feeling that she had to look away to contain it. Levi reached across the table and put his hand briefly on Danny's shoulder, and Danny accepted it, and nothing more needed to be said. Winter settled in, and with it the particular intimacy of a house that is kept warm against the cold, the long evenings in front of the fireplace, the early mornings when the frost was on the ground and the light was pale and thin. Levi had lived alone for 3 years after his father died, and he had not known, until this winter, how much of himself had been absent in that solitude. With Lucy in the house, with her particular presence, her voice, her laugh, her opinions, her warmth, everything was more fully inhabited, including himself. They talked in the evenings about everything. They disagreed about things still: the expansion of the railroad into the territory, the treatment of the Papago and Apache peoples whose land had been taken with a thoroughness that neither of them could fully look away from, the question of what the territory's future ought to look like. Levi had the banker's instinct toward order and established structures, and Lucy had the homesteader's experience of how those structures could be weaponized against the people without power. And they argued with the energy of two people who respected each other enough to take the argument seriously. In these conversations, Levi found his own views changing and sharpening, becoming more honest about the ways in which institutions he had served some people better than others. "The bank holds mortgages on 10 homesteads in this county," he said one evening in January, when they had been talking about the drought year and the foreclosures that had happened across the territory. The Slater homestead was the only one that had that meeting clause. "I put it in at the last minute, almost as an afterthought." He paused. "I have been thinking about making it a standard term in every mortgage agreement we issue." Lucy looked at him. "Would the board allow that?" "It is sound risk management," he said. "A bank that knows its debtors' situations before taking legal action makes better decisions. The board will understand that argument." He paused. "The other argument, that people deserve a chance to be heard, I will make that one too, but quietly." "Make it loudly," she said. He looked at her. "It will be more effective quietly," he said. "It will be more honest loudly," she said. They sat with that. "Both," he said finally. "We will do both." She smiled and reached across to put her hand in his, and the fire crackled and the Arizona night pressed cold against the windows. In the spring of 1885, 2 years after Levi had signed the foreclosure papers and found Lucy on his porch, Lucy told him she was expecting. She told him on a Tuesday morning in March, when he was in his office looking at ledger figures, and she appeared in the doorway with a particular expression that stopped him mid-column. "I have news," she said. He looked up, read her face, set down his pen. "How certain?" he asked. "Very," she said. He stood from his desk and crossed the room and took her face in his hands. She was looking up at him with that complicated expressiveness. She had the warmth and the wariness, the joy that was always attended by some awareness of what it might cost. He recognized the wariness for what it was, not about him, but about the world, which had not always been generous with the things she loved. "Everything will be all right," he said. "You cannot know that," she said. "No," he agreed. "But I am here regardless of what comes. You know that." She put her hands over his on her face. "I know that," she said. He kissed her forehead, and she leaned into him, and outside the window the spring pasture was bright green after the winter rains, and the creek was running full and bright. The pregnancy was not easy. The summer heat was hard on her, and she was sick through June, which was torture for a woman whose instinct was to be always moving. Levi managed the house and the barn work without complaint, adjusting his bank schedule further, delegating more, spending less time behind his desk and more time where he was needed. Lucy did not find being looked after any easier at 28 than she had at 26, but she was trying, and she was better at it than she had been. And when Levi brought her water in the evenings and sat with her on the porch when the day's heat was finally breaking, she leaned against his shoulder and allowed herself to be still. Danny came back to the homestead for the summer, ostensibly to help with the cattle and the fence line work, transparently because Lucy was his sister and he was worried. He did not say this. He said he needed somewhere to keep his horse and some good cooking. Lucy told him that was the least convincing thing she had ever heard, and he said he had no idea what she was talking about. Thomas and Martha came to supper on Sunday evenings through the summer, and the table was full in a way that the homestead had not been since before their father's decline, full in a way that was different from that earlier fullness, chosen rather than given, built rather than inherited. In October, after a labor that Levi was deeply grateful lasted no more than a day and a half, Lucy delivered a son. He was 7 pounds and dark-haired like both his parents and possessed of a voice that announced his presence with considerable authority. They named him Henry James Graves, after Levi's father and Lucy's maternal grandfather, respectively. Danny held the baby that first evening with the careful intensity of someone handling something they understand to be irreplaceable. Thomas arrived with Martha the following morning, and Thomas held his nephew and looked at Lucy with so much feeling in his face that even Martha had to look away. Levi sat beside Lucy that first night when the house was finally quiet, with Henry sleeping in the cradle by the bed, and held her hand while she slept, and looked at his son in the dark and felt the full weight of the life he had come into, the land and the woman and the child and the brothers and the history of all of it. And he was so entirely grateful that he had no adequate words for it, so he sat in the quiet and held it. In the weeks that followed, the homestead found a new rhythm built around Henry, who was a good baby, curious and alert, and who had his mother's expressiveness and his father's capacity for sustained attention, which even in infancy expressed itself as a tendency to watch everything in the room very carefully before deciding what he thought about it. Danny declared himself the boy's primary protector, and said so with such seriousness that even Levi, who took fatherhood with the full gravity it deserved, had to work to keep his expression straight. Levi had made good on his promise to the bank board about the meeting clause. By the end of 1885, it was standard language in every mortgage agreement issued by the Territorial Bank of Redrock Crossing. He had made the case to the board in the way he had told Lucy, quietly and on business grounds, and then loudly and on grounds of what was simply right, and the board had taken some convincing, but they had come around. It was a small change in the scope of things. But it was real, and it would matter to the people who came to the bank's counter asking for extensions, asking for hearings, asking to be seen. He wrote letters to 2 other bank managers in the territory, men he knew from his father's time, laying out the argument for the clause. One wrote back with polite interest. The other implemented a version of it within the year. These were quiet changes, the kind that did not appear in newspapers, but Levi had decided, partly under Lucy's influence and partly under the influence of looking his own history squarely in the eye, that he was more interested in real effects than visible ones. The homestead prospered over the next years in the gradual way that good land under careful management does, not dramatically but steadily, the way a creek fills in from a good rain season, not flooding but rising. They built a second barn in the spring of 1886. Levi bought the adjacent 12 acres when they came available in 1887, extending the eastern pasture to the ridge line. Lucy expanded the kitchen garden and began selling produce at the Red Rock Crossing Market, which she did partly for the income and partly because she enjoyed the market morning, the conversation, the community of it. Henry was walking by the following spring, stumping around the yard on legs that were both determined and unreliable, following his father with a devotion that Levi found simultaneously humbling and completely wonderful. He followed Lucy too, but Levi was the novelty, Lucy was the fixed point, and Levi was the person who appeared and disappeared, and therefore warranted sustained observation whenever he was present. Lucy was pregnant again by the summer of 1887, and this time the pregnancy was considerably easier, the summer cooler and her body more accustomed to it. She was 30 years old and in the full flower of a life that fit her well, and she moved through the warm months with a contentment that Levi sometimes caught her in unguarded, standing at the kitchen window or sitting on the porch steps in the evening, a stillness and a peace that he knew had been hard-won and was therefore more valuable than any peace that had come easily. "What are you thinking about?" he asked her one evening in August, finding her on the porch with that expression. She looked at him. "My father," she said, which surprised him. "He planted these cottonwoods the spring Thomas was born. He was a good man before he lost himself. I have been thinking about that." She was quiet. "I think I have been angry at him for a long time, for leaving us not just by dying but by going before that into the drinking, into the place he went where he couldn't be reached anymore." She looked at the cottonwoods, tall and full in the late summer. "But I think I have been angry at him in carrying the homestead at the same time as though I had to prove something, that it wouldn't fall just because he did." "You proved it," Levi said. "I did," she said. "And now I think I can let the proving go and just have it, the land, the life." She put her hand to her rounded belly. "This." He sat down beside her on the porch steps. "Good," he said. "It is good," she agreed. He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, the way she had learned to do, the way that no longer cost her something, and the cottonwoods moved in the warm evening air, and the land around them was green and settled. In November of 1887, Lucy delivered a daughter, born with a fine fuzz of dark hair and a pair of lungs that she used extensively to express her views on the situation. They named her Clara after Levi's mother, and from her first hours she was a different creature from her brother. Where Henry had been watchful, Clara was immediately communicative, making her opinions known with a vocal force that made Danny, when he met her the following day, say that she was going to be exactly like her mother. Lucy said, "Is that supposed to be a compliment or a warning?" "Both," Danny said, which was possibly the most honest thing he had ever said. Henry was fascinated and slightly alarmed by his sister, regarding her from a safe distance for the first week, and then gradually moving closer until he was willing to touch her hand, which she grabbed with a strength that surprised him, and that he did not entirely know what to make of, but from which he did not pull away. Danny, by this point, had saved enough money to make a down payment on 20 acres north of town. He came to them with the bank figures the following spring, and Levi sat with him at the kitchen table and went through the numbers the way he had once sat across from Lucy and gone through hers, and there was a particular satisfaction in this that went beyond the professional, something about the continuation of the story, the specific rightness of being the person who helped Danny Slater buy his first land instead of the person who took away someone else's. "The bank will make you the loan," Levi told him. "The terms are fair, and I am not saying that because you are my brother-in-law. The land is viable and you have a solid payment record from your work. You have earned this." Danny looked at him with those Slater eyes that had studied him from the barn doorway 6 years ago. "I know you would not say it if you did not mean it," he said. "That is why I came to you." Levi signed the loan papers, and it felt entirely different from the last time he had signed papers with the name Slater at the top. The years arranged themselves. Henry grew into a boy who had his father's steadiness and his mother's directness and his Uncle Danny's dry humor, and who took to the land with an aptitude that delighted Levi, not because he needed his son to love it, but because it was simply evident that Henry did, the way some people are evident in what they are meant for. Clara grew into a girl who had her mother's opinions and her father's capacity for listening, and who had decided by the age of 4 that she intended to be in charge of whatever situation she found herself in, which experience suggested was not an ambition she was likely to be talked out of. The bank continued. Harmon retired in 1889, and Levi hired a young man from Tucson who had studied accounting and had the kind of careful precision that the role required. The meeting clause held. The bank's foreclosure rate was lower than the territorial average, and it was not because the bank was soft. It was because the bank knew what was actually happening with its debtors before acting, which turned out, consistently, to result in better outcomes for everyone. Thomas and Martha had 3 children by 1890, a boy and 2 girls, and the extended family that gathered at the homestead on Sunday evenings was a large and lively collection of people who argued and laughed in roughly equal proportion. Danny had his 20 acres well established by 1890, had hired a hand, and was talking about buying the adjacent lot. He had not found a wife yet, and Lucy did not press him on it, having discovered that the Slater family tendency to arrive at things in their own time was better respected than managed. In the summer of 1890, Levi rode out to look at the eastern pasture extension, the 12 acres he had added in 1887, which he was thinking of fencing differently to better manage the cattle rotation. He had been on horseback all morning, and it was past noon, and he turned his horse back toward the homestead in the bright hot light, and coming up the rise toward the house he could see Lucy in the kitchen garden, weeding in the shade of the wide-brimmed hat she wore in summer, and Henry sitting near her with some project of his own involving a stick and a pile of rocks, and Clara, 5 years old, moving through the garden with the purposeful randomness of a child conducting important private business. He stopped his horse at the top of the rise and looked at this for a moment. 7 years ago, he had signed papers that should have taken this land. He had done it without sufficient thought, without the consideration that the situation deserved, without hearing the person most affected by it. The error had been his, and the consequences of it, the near loss of 40 acres and a woman's life's work, had been real and had come close to being permanent. He thought about that sometimes, not with guilt, because guilt was only useful to a point, but with a clear-eyed acknowledgement of what had almost happened and what that would have meant. The land would have sat unsold through the drought and been picked up at a fraction of its value by one of the large cattle companies moving through the territory. Lucy would have taken her brothers somewhere, started again somewhere, survived. She was the kind of person who survived. But this would not have been. The cottonwoods along the south fence line, tall and graceful against the summer sky, the cattle in the eastern pasture, the barn and the house and the kitchen garden. Henry with his stick and his rocks, and Clara conducting her important private business among the bean rows, and Lucy in her wide-brimmed hat with the particular competence of someone at home in their own life. He nudged his horse forward and came down into the yard, and Lucy looked up from her weeding and shaded her eyes against the sun. "Stay for lunch," she said, which was their long-standing joke since he had nowhere else to be. "I believe I will," he said, swinging down from the saddle. Henry abandoned his rocks and came over, and Levi scooped him up with one arm. Clara appeared from the beans. "Papa," Clara said with the air of someone delivering important news, "there is a snake under the bean row and I am watching it." "Is there?" he said. "It is a small snake," she said. "I do not think it is dangerous, but I am watching it to be sure." "That is very responsible of you," he said. Lucy was watching this from under her hat with an expression that was purely warm. He met her eyes over the top of their son's head, and she smiled, the full, uncalculated smile that he had first seen in his bank office 7 years ago and that still, every time, did the same thing to him. He set Henry down and crossed the garden to her, and she tipped her face up to him, and he kissed her in the middle of the bean rows with Clara providing a running commentary on the snake's current movements. "I love you," he said against her temple. "I know," she said. "I love you too." She put her hand on his chest, the way she had learned to do, easy and entirely certain. "Come and have lunch." They went inside, the four of them, into the cool of the house and the smell of whatever Lucy had left on the stove, and sat at the table that had heard 1,000 conversations and would hear 1,000 more, and the Arizona summer blazed outside the windows, and the land that had nearly been taken away lay green and settled and entirely, permanently theirs. In the autumn of 1890, Danny found his person. She was a schoolteacher who had come to Red Rock Crossing the previous September to run the town's one-room school, a woman named Alyssa Bright who was 24 to Danny's 25, and who had what Lucy described, accurately, as the exact combination of patience and backbone that Danny required. They had circled each other for the entire school year and into the summer, and by September it was clear to everyone in Red Rock Crossing, except apparently Danny and Alyssa themselves, that the situation needed resolving. Lucy invited Alyssa to Sunday supper, which she had been doing occasionally since Alyssa arrived in town, and had nothing to do with Danny's obvious feelings for her. At this particular Sunday supper, she also invited Danny, whom she told was coming for the roast and did not tell anything else. When Danny arrived and found Alyssa at the table, he looked at his sister with an expression that said he was fully aware of what was happening and was choosing, for once in his life, not to resist it. The evening was warm and the conversation was easy, and when supper was over and Lucy was pointedly taking a very long time in the kitchen and Levi was taking an equally long time, checking something apparently important in the barn, Danny and Alyssa sat on the porch and had a conversation that ended with Danny asking if she would do him the honor of keeping company with him, formally and with intention, and Alyssa saying that she had been waiting a considerable time for him to ask, and the answer was yes. They were married the following spring, in the same church where Levi and Lucy had married 8 years before, and the whole town came again, because Red Rock Crossing had apparently decided that Slater family events were community events and intended to maintain this policy indefinitely. By 1892, the homestead that had once been mortgaged to the point of foreclosure was paid off entirely. Levi rode into the bank on a Tuesday morning in March and handed Harmon's successor, the young man from Tucson, the final payment on the Slater land mortgage, and took the satisfaction of watching the man mark the account closed and stamp the deed clear. He brought the deed home that evening and put it on the kitchen table in front of Lucy. She picked it up, read it, set it down, looked at him. "Free and clear," she said. "Free and clear," he said. She stood up from the table and put her arms around him, which she did as naturally now as breathing, the ease of someone who had learned to lean and had found that the person she was leaning on was reliable. He held her in the kitchen with the evening light coming through the windows and the sound of Henry and Clara doing something energetic in the yard. "My mother would not believe this," she said, into his collar. "If she could see this," she paused. "I should write to her." "You should," he said. He had been telling her this for years. Lucy's relationship with her mother was complicated and unresolved, made of old hurts and long distances and a reluctance on both sides to try the thing that might not work. He had learned not to push but to hold the possibility open. "I will write to her," Lucy said, pulling back and looking at him. "Soon. Write to her this week," he said, gently. "The things that need to be said are better said while there is time to say them." She looked at him for a long moment, with the full, clear, amber gaze that had not changed since the first time she had turned it on him, on his porch, in the long evening light of a summer he would never forget. "All right," she said. "This week." She wrote the letter on Thursday. Her mother wrote back in May, a cautious, careful letter that was also unexpectedly warm, full of questions about the children she had never met and a tentative expression of a desire to visit. Lucy read the letter at the kitchen table with an expression that moved through several things before settling on something open and unguarded that Levi had not seen there before, something that looked like old grief finally being put down. "She wants to come," Lucy said. "Good," Levi said. "It might be complicated," she said. "It will probably be complicated," he said. "That does not mean it is not worth doing." She looked at the letter again, then folded it carefully and set it on the table. "I will write her back tomorrow." She looked up at Levi. "Thank you." "For what?" he said. "For telling me to write the letter," she said. "For knowing that was something I needed to do even when I was not ready to know it myself." She reached across the table and took his hand. "You have always been very good at that. You are not hard to know," he said, "once you let someone in." She smiled at that particular smile, the one that reached her eyes and made everything more vivid. "Neither are you," she said, "for a man who wore such a severe expression at the beginning." "Professionally severe," he said. "I was at work." "You were at work when I found you on the road to your own house," she said. "Technically still on bank time," he said. She laughed and squeezed his hand, and outside the window the Slater land lay in the late spring afternoon, paid for and clear and green, the creek running, the cattle grazing, the cottonwoods along the south fence line standing in the permanence of things that had been planted with intention and had grown in the fullness of time into exactly what they were meant to be. In the summer of 1893, Lucy's mother came. Her name was Ruth, and she arrived on the stage from New Mexico with the particular wariness of someone who has been away from a place long enough to feel like a stranger in it. And Lucy met her at the stage stop with the wariness of someone who has learned not to expect too much. They stood looking at each other on the main street of Red Rock Crossing, two women with the same dark hair and the same amber eyes and a decade of distance between them. And then Ruth said, "You look well." And Lucy said, "You do too." And they both knew that was the beginning and not the destination. Levi met her that evening at the homestead. Ruth Slater was a composed, direct woman in her mid-50s, who had the same quality of careful assessment her daughter had, and who looked at the homestead and the land and the clear-eyed, steady man her daughter had married with an expression that was partly relief and partly something that might have been belated pride. Henry, who was 8, regarded his grandmother with the same watchful consideration he brought to everything new, and then decided she was trustworthy, which he communicated by showing her his current project, a detailed map of the homestead that he was making from a hand-drawn survey. Clara, who was 5 and had no patience for the watchful approach, climbed directly into Ruth's lap and announced that she had been wanting a grandmother for a long time and was glad one had finally arrived. Ruth looked over Clara's head at Lucy with an expression that cracked something in both of them, and Lucy said, "She has always known exactly what she wants." And Ruth said, "I wonder where she gets that." And they both laughed, a little surprised by it. The visit lasted 3 weeks, and it did not resolve everything, because some things cannot be resolved in 3 weeks, but it moved something. There were difficult evenings and honest conversations, and a few moments where old pains surfaced and had to be sat with. And there were also long afternoons on the porch, and suppers that Thomas and Martha and Danny and Alyssa came to that were full of the noise and warmth of a family that had been fractured and was not entirely mended but was, at least, in the process. When Ruth left, she said she would come again at Christmas. She did. She came every Christmas after that, and eventually every summer as well. And in time the difficult evenings became fewer and the porch afternoons longer, and the thing between Lucy and her mother became something that was not the relationship they had lost but a new one, built on what was real and present rather than on what might have been. Levi watched all of this with the quiet attention he had always brought to Lucy's life, close enough to be there if he was needed, and far enough to let her navigate it herself. She had never needed someone to solve things for her. She had always only needed someone to stay. He understood that this was both the simplest and the most important thing he had ever been asked to do, and he did it without reservation, every day, for all the years of their life together. Henry and Clara grew up on the land as their mother had grown up on it, inheriting her love for it and her knowledge of it. And if their childhood was considerably more stable than hers had been, they still learned the same things: how to work, how to hold on, how to be honest with themselves about what they were capable of. Levi taught them arithmetic and fence line and horse management, and the particular satisfaction of doing something well that needed to be done. Lucy taught them everything else. The bank changed over the years. By the mid-1890s, Levi had reduced his involvement to 2 days a week, primarily for oversight and the more complex account reviews, and had handed the day-to-day management entirely to his Tucson-trained successor, who turned out to be thoroughly capable and in some ways more modern-minded than Levi himself. The meeting clause had become standard practice. More than that, Levi had worked with the Territorial Bank Association to promote similar protections in other institutions, presenting the business case at the 1891 Territorial Bankers meeting in Tucson and making, more quietly, the ethical one. He was not certain how much good it did. Some things moved slowly and some things did not move at all, but he was certain that it was more than no effort, and he was certain that the effort mattered. In 1895, Thomas's oldest boy, who was 11 and named Robert, fell from a horse and broke his arm, and the whole family descended on Thomas and Martha's house in town for the 3 days Robert was recovering, filling it with food and noise and company. Levi sat up with Thomas on the second night when Thomas was restless and worried in the particular way of a parent, and they talked until well past midnight about things that ranged from Robert's arm to the state of the cattle market to what Thomas remembered about their father and what he did not. "I was too young when he went," Thomas said. "I mostly remember him laughing. The bad years I mostly watched through Lucy. She carried a lot of that," Levi said. "She still does," Thomas said. "Not the grief of it anymore, I think, but the memory of it. She does not forget things that cost her." He paused. "I am glad she has someone who understands what they are worth." "I understand exactly what they are worth," Levi said. The summer of 1897 was the best year the Slater homestead, which everyone still called the Slater homestead, by long habit and Lucy's firm preference, even though it was legally Graves' land, had seen in Levi's time on it. The rains were good, the cattle market was strong, and the creek ran all summer, which had not happened every year. Lucy stood at the kitchen window one evening in August and looked out at the pasture in the long light and said, "This is what my father meant, what he was talking about when he talked about this land." She was quiet for a moment. "He did know it well." "He did," Levi said. "You knew it better." "I knew it after him," she said. "I built on what he knew." She looked at Levi. "The same way I built on what I had after everything." "We built it," he said. She turned from the window and looked at him with that clear, warm, amber look that had been the most consistent feature of his life for 14 years. "We built it," she agreed. Henry was 12 and had recently made it clear that he intended to stay on the land, to farm and ranch it, which had not surprised anyone. Clara, 10, had made it equally clear that she intended to do whatever she decided to do, and that nobody should assume they knew what that was, which had also surprised nobody. Levi had the quiet certainty of a man who knew that both of them would be exactly fine, because they had come from Lucy, and Lucy did not produce people who were not fine. In the evening of that August day, they sat on the porch, the same porch he had come home to 14 years ago, and found her on his steps with her shotgun and her fury and her legitimate claim, and watched the light go down over the land, the red and gold of it, the particular drama of an Arizona sunset that never quite stopped being astonishing. "I have been thinking about that first evening," he said, "when I came home and found you on the porch." She made a sound that was partly laugh, partly something more tender. "I was so angry," she said, "and so frightened underneath the anger I was terrified of what I would do if you sent me away." "What would you have done?" he said. "Fought the foreclosure in court," she said, which would have cost money I did not have and probably failed. She paused, but I would have tried. I know, he said, you would always try. You did not send me away, she said. No, he said, I listened. That was all I needed, she said. At the beginning, just someone to listen. He took her hand, as he had done 1,000 times, as he intended to do for all the time remaining, and they sat in the evening together, two people who had arrived at each other from opposite directions and found, in the middle of difficult territory, that the other person was exactly what the map had been missing. The cottonwoods along the south fence line stood in the last light, tall and still in the August air, their leaves catching the red of the setting sun, each one of them older than Henry and Clara combined, each one a witness to the years the land had held through drought and loss and foreclosure papers, and the particular stubbornness of a woman who refused to let it go, and the particular reckoning of a man who had learned in time that the best thing he had ever done was listen. The land remembered what it was supposed to do. It always had. They sat until the stars came out and the night was warm and immense around them, and the homestead settled into its nighttime quiet, and the last thing Lucy said before they went inside was, "We did all right, Levi Graves." "We did better than all right," he said. She squeezed his hand and he stood with her, and they went inside together into the house that was full of their life, and closed the door on the beautiful, completed dark.